Mark and I are still stumbling along in the wild world of Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke in the almost psychedelic conversation. And we are up to about 1 hour and 42 minutes roughly. So I'm going to share screen and we're going to watch a little bit of this, and then Mark and I are going to put our heads together and see what we can make of it. And this starts at the point at which John has just done this crazy explanation of speculative realism. He got very excited when he was talking about it. And Jordan is about to respond to it. Jordan's response is pretty funny, so I wanted to start at that point.
I have to digest that in ways that I'm not going to be conscious of. I don't know how to follow that with the appropriate question.
Well, I mean,
it's the depth within that allows you to appreciate the depth without.
It makes me think of the Psalms. I mean, it's the verse, you know, the deep calling to the deep, and that's not you calling, right? That's what I mean about the transjectivity.
Yes, well, that's also that's also akin to the metaphor of rescuing the Father from the underworld, because we're constantly doing that. So the Father is in the inner underworld always, as a consequence of our reflection of the external social and natural worlds.
So I didn't see that in when you've talked about that before. You're seeing a deep kind of resonance between those where each discloses the other.
Well, you saw it. I'm just pointing out my vision of it, I suppose.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop right there because it's pretty in depth. I don't want to bite off more than we can chew.
Yeah, that's literally about depth, right? The depth within makes me appreciate the depth without. Yeah, it's all deep.
Yeah. I thought it was pretty interesting, first of all, that John says the deep calls to the deep. And he said, and that's not you calling.
Right.
So you know John better than I do. What did he mean by that? I mean, he brings that up as his idea of transjectivity, but if it's not you calling, then who is it?
Right. Well, this is where the fancy footwork begins with John, always. Right. So he's making this call to transjectivity. It's like, all right, well, what is emerging from? Transjectivity is basically a capitulation of emergence, right? It's just basically saying emergent. You have two things, and then there's a third thing. That's emergence, right?
Well, but does he ever specify whether that's weak emergence or strong emergence, or does he ever talk about strong emergence?
No, he doesn't talk about it not in those terms that I recall, right?
Okay.
He's just saying something emerges from, right?
Okay.
Because emergence per se solves all their problems. The science people, that solves all their problems. Oh, no, it's emergence. Magic. It's this magic variable we never define. Oh, well, yeah, if you're gonna invoke a magic variable, then you're gonna solve all your problems with it, right? It's Einstein's constant, right? It's like, yeah, if I invoke the magic variable of Einstein's constant, then all of Einstein's stuff works. Fair enough, but it's still magic, right? You still got the magic. The magic came from somewhere, right? It's very much the trick that science always plays. There's always a magic, and they just say, no, that's the magic. We don't talk about that. But look at all this other stuff. Once you assume the magic, you can build a shore, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's interesting that he invokes that, and then he says, oh, I didn't see before that you were doing this disclosure thing. In other words, what he didn't see is the opponent processing and what Peterson was talking about. So John wasn't using his own opponent processing metaphor to apply to Jordan stuff to see where Jordan's getting this rescue from the belly of the whale stuff, which is really just revivification of the old structures that were built that you survive on, right?
Right. So when he talks about, so I thought that was really interesting. This is the first time I've really seen where he was coming from on that rescuing your father from the belly of the whale, because he goes on to specify, and he says, the Father is in our underworld always as a consequence of our reflection of the external and social natural worlds. I used to think when he was talking about the Father, that he was talking strictly about this archetypal figure, but he's really talking about what's built into our psyche based on not only our own individual past experience, but the past experience of all the generations before us,
right?
That has carried through in culture and probably in epigenetics and all of
Right.
these other things that creates, it's a little bit of that experiential DNA thing that I talk about.
Yep.
But it's only a part of that. But so that there's that father thing. So deep calling to deep
Mhm.
is the deep inside of us, what my mother used to call my apperception mass, that pattern recognition thing is
Mhm.
is calling to the other deep within me. So and John says, oh, well, each discloses the other.
Right.
So he's somehow seeing this psychological, opponent. I guess it would be like an opponent processing going on
Component processing in his
from my what I wouldn't call it my visible mind, but my mind that's conscious of what I'm navigating, and then this other mind that's in me that I'm not conscious of.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But yeah, he's always avoiding the appeal to the ineffable. It's always avoiding it. Even when he talks about Neoplatonism, he never talks about that aspect of it ever.
Well, it sounds like Jordan is also avoiding that appeal to the ineffable. If he's talking about the father being this storehouse of memories and everything, then where's the ineffable in that?
Well, it's implied in that, again, I think, you're right. It's the pattern of rescuing your father from the belly of the whale works at all levels of analysis, right? To use Peterson's terms. And so for him, culture comes from somewhere. Where does culture come from? Well, for him, it seems to come from something like what you might define God as, if we want to be all Peterson about it, right? So the fact that there's a structure and a hierarchical way of inhabiting the world that actually works through time, right? And then we're constantly revivifying that. We have to rescue it. We have to, rescuing it, in my mind, is related to this idea that you need to earn your wisdom or under knowledge or something, right? Like, oh yeah, you need to earn this. You can't just take it for granted, because then you're living off the bones of your ancestors. So if you go to Europe, you can see people living off the bones of their ancestors. They're not like they aren't even putting up new buildings. Like it's really bad, right? They're just sort of like, we're just gonna suck the marrow dry out of this place, and we're not going to, renew our any of our traditions. We're not gonna like update the Magna Carta, for example, and make a constitution, which might have been a good idea for them. Some of them have learned recently that maybe we did need a document. maybe that was important after all. So that's a form of revivifying the father, right? You're going into the belly of the whale and, oh yeah, we have a Magna Carta. We should do something with it, right? We should update it. We should ensconce it as a sacred document, instead of just assuming that everyone's going to point to it when they need to, and that will work forever, because obviously it stopped working at some point in their history, and I don't think they knew when, right? In the UK in particular.
Okay, so looking at the model of order and chaos and the process which navigates into chaos to grab potential order and brings it back in to revivify order, is rescuing the father from the belly of the whale the revivifying of the order, or is it the updating of the process?
Why wouldn't it be both?
Okay.
And how are those two things not interlocked?
Well, Jordan usually differentiates between the order and the chaos and the navigator, or the one that's riding the wave in between the two.
Right, but the process of rescuing is you're taking something that was ordered in the past and you're updating it somehow. So you're doing both. You have to be combining the current chaos with the old order somehow.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go on from where we were then.
Okay.
And see what else we can see.
I think that's right. I think,
and it's
yeah, we're rescuing, as we're rescuing.
It's the discordance. See, it's interesting because it's the discordance between the map and the reality that drives the seeking of the Father within, right? Because You see what I mean? Because when your desire does not manifest itself and you despair, you call to the Father within to reveal himself. And so that's the rescuing of the Father from the dragon of chaos.
So you
and you're kenotic, right? Because you're kenotic, you're your books behind you, but which is why you array them behind you in no small part. But as you said, in your own defense, when you're putting your ideas forth, I'm just the gist. There's another t-shirt. But that's the same idea as kenosis.
I know, the emptying. And I'm deeply interested in the relationship between kenosis and henosis. Because
I don't know henosis.
Oh, henosis is sort of.
It's horrifying and great to talk to someone who knows a whole bunch of things I don't know at all.
Oh, thank you, Jordan. That's quite the compliment coming from someone like you. Henosis is it's the summation of the Neoplatonic anagogy, the Neoplatonic ascent, whereby the one within you becomes one with the one without until there is only the one. It's ultimate at one-ment. And also it has the sense of atonement because it's the ultimate healing of that which is most existentially distressing to us, which is our being separated from the ground of reality within and the ground of reality without, and also separating those.
Yes, so that is what is most existentially distressing to us. You agree with that?
Yes.
So that's why I titled my next book the title that I am titling it, which is We Who Wrestle with God.
I'm going to stop there because they go on with that idea in more depth, and we certainly want to talk about that, but I don't want to let that take us from this original idea about the disclosure between the map and the reality. The discordance of the disparity between the map and the reality is what drives the seeking of the Father within. When your desire does not manifest itself and you despair, you call to the Father within to manifest himself.
Right.
Now, even though I know that he's talking about the Father as being this boatload of, cultural memories and history and all of that, when he talks this way, it talks very much like he's actually talking the Christian talk about when you despair. That's one of the things that brings you back to the Father, is when you despair. Because right. When things are going well, we just tend to just go off and do our own thing, and hey, everything's great, and I don't need any Father. I'm fine on my own.
I don't think Jordan makes a distinction in his own thinking, and I don't think he should. So one of my short form gotchas for people is, so you think there's no God, huh? Well, let me ask you a question. If you believe the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts, what's the sum of all human goodness? Right? Because now you're trapped. Like if you obviously the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts. Nobody disagrees with that, right? That's why they invoke emergence. But what would be the sum of all human goodness? Well, there you go. Like that's a good definition for God right there. And you can't really get around it propositionally. You're kind of screwed, right? Kind of just hit you, like boom, you're down and out for the count. So what does that look like? Well, in history, it looks like whatever's been successful evolutionarily. So it's all the components we mentioned before.
If you're strictly speaking on, if you're strictly speaking on a materialist level, yeah.
Well, even a non-materialist level, because the order that manifests successfully throughout evolution is not a materialist thing, right? Order manifests. Order isn't the thing. The order comes from the emanation, right? I talked about this. Emanation is here, and you got to pick an emanation or two, right? But you can't do all of them, we'll say. And if you have an emergence and it doesn't happen close to an emanation, it doesn't stick. What is that? That's not material. That's specifically, none of that is material. The things that we see are material, but they're not the thing, right? That's confusing the description of the thing for the thing itself, right? So I would say
It
that.
makes me think a little bit about, I just had a conversation with Glenn, the physicist, and we had a picture up of all of the potential choices that could be made. And it looks like a decision tree. It looks very much like a tree with all the branches going off. Of course, each person's life would only be one of those threads moving off according to all the various decisions being made. But when it all gets put together, all the potential choices, it looks like a tree, right? Which made me think about trees because, and I've mentioned this before, that I had an arborist once who explained to me that each kind of a tree has its own sense-making system about how to make that particular kind of a tree. Because an elm tree looks different than an oak tree, looks different than a maple tree, looks different than a pine tree. And the information is in the crown. So if you cut off the crown of a tree, then the tree will not grow into its intended shape. It will grow all which way, just wacky, crazy. The branches will just go shooting off or shooting straight up. Or so you must never cut off the crown of a tree if you want a beautifully shaped tree. Now, the crown does not determine exactly every branch and where it's going to be in exactly every leaf. There's still a lot of differentiation between one elm tree and another elm tree, but they're recognizably elm trees. So a tree grows from the root and from the crown.
At the same time.
Both are necessary, right?
Right. So the roots provide the potential and the crown provides the constraint.
Yes, I guess you could put it that way.
The roots are the emergence and the crown is the emanation.
But
the emanations are constraints.
But in another way, though, when you showed this as being the emanation, it made me think about all of the ends of all those different branches that are out there that are at the end of days, where all the potential could be. So there's some sort of a way in which all that potential that's out there is also feeding back into the initial intention.
Right. Well, they get into that. And that's very Neoplatonic. Right. That's what.
Oh, okay. Is that what he's talking about when he talks about henosis?
Yeah. Well, that's harder for me to answer. He doesn't talk a lot about henosis. So,
but he described it as anagoge. He's talked about anagoge before, but I don't know what that is. So why don't you explain anagoge to me?
So, well, let me go for henosis first, because that's where we were. So, kenosis, right, is you and all the books that make you up. Right. And henosis is you returning to the one and becoming one with the one.
Well, kenosis is you and all the books. Right. Kenosis is when you empty yourself, you make yourself a channel sort of for all the books. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's the idea that you're more than the sum of just you, right? So you're differentiated in your experience. And henosis is returning to the one, not undifferentiated. So it's a very Eastern idea, right? Like, oh, you're one thing and you're unique. It's like, well, yeah, but you're also part of the Tao. It's like, well, make up your mind. Which is it, right? But it's both, and that's Neoplatonic, right? It's this idea that you're striving for the unity.
So maybe John and Jordan are using kenosis in a different way then, because I'm pretty sure Jordan is using kenosis in the way in which it is in, I want to say Philippians chapter 2, where it says that Jesus emptied himself. He gave up his throne, he gave up his glory, and he emptied himself and became a servant. And that word emptied himself, that is kenosis. So, but it sounds like you're saying John is using kenosis in a slightly different way.
Well, I don't think that's different. I think it's a different conception, but I think you're saying the same thing. So if you're at the top and you're everything and you give that up, what are you? Well, you're one of the pieces, right? You're now differentiated. Right. And it's Jordan who used the books. He said, you are you and all the books behind you. That's what he said kenosis was. And then he said, well, what's henosis? And John said, well, it's me merged with the one again, which would be the opposite of what you described. So yeah.
What did you think Jordan meant when he said you and all the books behind you? Because maybe you and I have a different picture of what that picture says in our minds.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, it's just the fact that of your uniqueness, right? So even if I read all the same books you read, we're still not the same person. Like, we're not one thing. We're two different things. And that's what differentiates us, is the sum total of our experiences. That's the differentiator. So if you have a differentiation, you're not one, right? There's a differentiator there, right? And then henosis is returning back to one, so that everything's one thing again. It's like, well, and those are independent processing with one another, right? So fair enough.
Okay, yeah. So when I think about John and all his books, I'm thinking, because John has read all those books, and of course he's read them through his filter,
Right.
which is sum total of his experiences. Yeah, so he has become, in a sense, John has become who he is, not just by virtue of his experience, but by virtue of all the other people's experiences from all past history that is bound up in those books,
Right.
that is now bound up in him.
Right. Which causes him to be differentiated from the one, right? But henosis is the lack of differentiation from the one, where you're returning back to the source or something. If you're in the matrix, right? You're returning back. Right?
Yeah. Although I suppose there's some way in which, if we all, I mean, maybe this was part of the reasoning behind Western civilization teaching in the universities, and behind the teaching of the classics, that if we all had a body of work that was unifying for everybody, that it would give us a more of a unified culture and give us some sort of a ground to stand on as a people.
Right. There's another way to do that too. It's called church, by the way, but yeah. Or you can burn down all the monasteries and then need to get your ideals back some other way instead of the monasteries. But I'm just speculating here, by the way. Yeah. And I think that's in John's theories. I mean, I think he mentions, in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, I think he mentions, like, yeah, we got rid of all the monasteries, and we replaced it with the academy. And so the monasteries are sort of like the church closer to Jesus, if you will. Paul Van der Clay did that great thing on, the reputation of Jesus is intact. The reputation of the church is in tatters because it doesn't live up to the ideal. Like, well, but they don't have the monasteries anymore to pull them towards purity, in essence, right? Without sort of going overboard or something, hopefully. Or maybe with going over. I mean, maybe that's the purpose of the monasteries, is to go overboard and make that sacrifice in that, more academic realm, because they were the academics of their day, so that the church could be more normal, but still have a pull in the right direction, because the church seems to be pulled in the wrong direction now, right? They're not able to stand up to the other principalities anymore. They're just sort of giving in to the government, giving in to the capitalism, and giving in instead of, having an ideal other than Jesus, we'll say an earthly ideal, like the monasteries, to pull them back towards, their own power base, if you will. Although I hate that language, it's actually not wrong in this case, right? Their own base of control.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the monasteries, because I had a lengthy conversation with Gavin Ashenden the other day, which hasn't published yet, but I think it's going to publish tomorrow. And my original thought in talking with him was to parse out open and relational theology and process philosophy and some of these things, and maybe even speculative realism and some of these things that we're hearing talked about. But Gavin didn't want any of that. He just wanted to say, we need to, instead of talking about all these ethereal things, we need to get back to having a Christian mind. And then he went on to talk about the monasteries and the brothers and Saint Benedict and these guys that lived out the meaning of the word and cared for others and showed us what it looked like. And he's very passionate about that idea.
Well, it's interesting, because John is of the same mind to some extent. John has said, look, we don't need everybody to be wise. We need more wise men to exemplify wisdom. Yeah, sounds like we need monasteries to me. Just throwing that out there. We had a way to do that.
That's just Jordan's whole thing about, act.
Right.
Act.
Well, it's interesting that Jordan's not there in a way. It's like, hello, Jordan, hello. Right. Because he's not coming at it the way John's got this, in some sense, ridiculous, although it's beautiful and it's not, none of it's wrong as near as I can tell. Right. It goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks and all the way through and, identifies this long thread of the meaning crisis, unnecessarily long, in my opinion. But I mean, there are a bunch of contributing factors, so fair enough. And I think he hit them all which would be amazing, but I think he did. I can't find any holes in it. I haven't heard anybody else say, oh, John, you missed this. And by now you would have heard something. So maybe he got them all. But, the big problems happened more recently. And I don't think he's, I think I'm more in the Peterson camp on what might have caused that rather than Vervaeke going all the way back to the ancient Greeks and saying, oh, the language is screwed up or something.
Mhm.
Or religion went wrong, or whatever of his three theses you want to grab on that. I don't really have an opinion. I don't think any of them are particularly helpful. But the idea that we should have more wise men to exemplify what wisdom looks like, to exemplify the fact of wisdom, to put wisdom back into the world because it's gone, like nobody even knows what wisdom is or why they would care about it. More importantly,
That would certainly make a lot of women very happy.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so. Well, but I mean, we got rid of the monasteries. It's like, well, we had a solution to this. Why don't we move back and get it? And the reason why we don't move back is the big evil of our day, I think, is progressivism per se. This idea that you don't go back and fix your mistakes. You keep moving forward and finding a new way. And it's like, yeah, but actually, if you made a wrong turn, that's never going to work. It's never going to work. And we don't have a sense. It's very much the problem in the software industry today. We're going to fail forward. Yep. At a certain point, it's not going to work anymore. And that's what I used to do. I used to fix projects that were I was like, yeah, you just need to rewrite this. Like, I'm sorry. There's no way around it.
Didn't we sort of learn that lesson with Y2K? Even though it wasn't as big a problem as people thought it was, they still had to go back and do some rewriting there before they could move forward, right?
It was a way bigger problem than anyone realized, thanks to the literal heroic efforts. And, and on one hand, I was part of that. On the other hand, I really wasn't. But there were some real problems that got fixed. I mean, there was some machinery out there that was definitely going to break everybody's billing. And I do mean everybody, right? Or screw up every bank account at 5 different banks because they were all using the same broken bank wire transfer software that was going to break in the same way for all the banks. So it was, but it caused a big problem, right? That precipitated the computer crash back then. But we don't go back and we don't learn these lessons.
The other place that I've noticed that we don't go back and that is really just devastating is the healthcare system.
Yes,
because
that's my big one too.
Yeah, because if you take that all the way back to the early part of the 20th century and look at how the problems actually arose, you could solve them, but you can't solve them if you're only looking at where we're at today. And all they ever look at is the symptoms of the problems that are there today, and there's no solution there. So it's going to get worse and worse.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you have Ted Kennedy saying, yeah, I know I passed HMOs in the 80s, but they were a mistake. And it's like, okay, but why don't you undo that? And then you have the people who don't know the history and they go, no, what we really need is more government control over healthcare. And it's like, you do realize that it was the price controls after World War II that caused the system of healthcare that you're complaining about. And they don't know the history. It's like, you caused this problem with your socialism. Right. Yeah, and now you're trying to fix it by more socialism. That
was also the government intrusion into the relationship between the employer and the employee on the whole insurance thing as a way of helping them incentivize employment through the insurance program. And all of that screwed things up. Yeah. I mean,
right. But that was due to the wage controls. Oh, you want wage controls? We'll give you wage controls. But now we don't have wage to hire people. So we'll have to offer them different benefits packages to get better people. Okay. But you created that problem. Like you need to go back and fix that whole thing. And they had a chance to do it. And of course, they national healthcare plan would have fixed everything, where they just said, you can't have all these insurance companies in the States. They all insurance has to be transportable across state lines. That would have fixed a bunch of problems. It wouldn't have fixed everything, but it would have fixed a bunch of problems. but they didn't do that. Like that would have restored competition in the market, for example, which would have been a good thing.
That was one of the ideas in George W. Bush's plan, I think.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Republicans, well, because they understood that that would restore competition to the market, right?
Yeah.
And if you rip off the Massachusetts system, which I happen to know way too much about, so in Massachusetts, they had 117 or something insurance companies. They passed their crazy laws that were the precursor to the ACA in the 90s. And the number of insurance companies went to 7 and quickly dropped to 3, one of which almost went out of business. And the current governor of Massachusetts saved that company single-handedly. And so they had 3 insurance companies from 117 or something, right? And then the system collapsed further such that, and I was actually in the system for a while. I shut my business down for a couple of years because healthcare was, you could get better healthcare for free from the state by not working than you could buy at any price, literally any price. You could not buy the healthcare plan Massachusetts had in, I think it was the early to mid 2000s. Nothing was more than $10. I mean, like ambulance ride, $10. It was really cheap. And Boston has the best hospitals in the world. So it was great healthcare for no money. And all you had to do was not make, if you made under $40,000 a year, which was a decent wage back then you qualified for this. You know, it wasn't worth working unless you were going to make significantly more than that. So that it caused this huge working gap in the system. And nobody knows about this. And then we adopt that nationally, and what happens? The system collapses, right? Whole insurance. There's one insurer in South Carolina, 0 competition, right? So a bunch of states had no insurance companies for a while, right? So it just, they knew what was going to happen. They had to have known. It's what happened in Massachusetts. They just didn't care, basically. So
no, I think it was written. I think that was, and I don't want to, we really shouldn't be getting into political stuff, but I think that was part of the intention of the system, was to force a collapse so that we'd end up with a single payer. If the system falls apart, then you have an excuse. I mean, you can't just institute single payer because everybody will scream, oh, communism. So instead you set up a system that has the seeds of collapse within it. And then when it collapses, you can say, see, now we need single payer.
I'm going to publicly call you a conspiracy theorist and say, yeah, I was there all along. Totally believe.
That's the last I'm going to talk about politics, because I don't want everybody to go and leave my channel just because
it's good to look at examples where we're not going back as a society, like societal problems that we could fix potentially if we go back far enough and find out where these problems actually came from. But because of this progressive attitude where we're like, no, we're just going to move forward and we're just going to fix things in the future. Always. We're never going to go back and critique ourselves, which is sort of a failure of the postmodern ethos in some sense, which I find fascinating. We're never going to go back and critique ourselves and say, oh, wait, this is where we went wrong. We need to go back and fix this structural problem because this structure is never going to work. We don't do that. And so it's good to point at not just the little things like rescuing my father, but also the big things that society is not doing as a whole because of the ethos of progressive ideology, right? This idea that you can just keep going forward and moving forward and technology is going to solve it in the future anyway. Like that's not necessarily true. A lot of things don't scale.
Well, even on a personal level, it's way easier to live that way. And so it's easy. I mean, it's easy for me to cop out and say, well, we don't really need to fix that problem in our relationship. We can just like sweep it under the rug and keep plugging along and try to make things go forward. And that's the way we are. I think as human beings, we'd rather not face our multiple failures in the past.
Right.
And make something of them. So let's just see where Jordan and John are at this place. I'm going to back it up just a hair because my sound seems to be behind my.
Which is are being separated from the ground of reality within and the ground of reality without, and also separating those.
Yes, so that is what is most existentially distressing to us. You agree with that?
Yes.
So that's why I titled my next book the title that I am titling it, which is "We Who Wrestle with God," because that's our fundamental problem, is that dissociation. But I believe that's the case.
So that calls something forth for me now, the wrestling.
But then that means that okay, please go ahead with that
what I
first.
was going to say is, we're talking about this bivalence of how reality presents to itself. This is Heidegger's big thing, right? And there's a sense in which it shines into our intelligibility,
shines forth,
but it also withdraws, right? It withdraws into its moreness. It shines with its suchness, and it withdraws into its moreness. And wrestling is like that, if you think about it, because wrestling, I'm making contact, but I'm also being surprised. Think about the two phenomenologies of our sense of realness. One is when things are confirmed, and it's real because look at how it all fits together.
Right.
And then the other is, geez, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. That surprises me.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That is the two things that are the most real, isn't it? Isn't that something?
Yeah, and wrestling is both of those. And notice it's a conformity metaphor too, right? You have to come into conformity, literally form yourself to the body of your opponent, right? And you're right. So there's the shining, but there's also the realness because they're shocking you from beyond. I hadn't picked that up on the wrestling metaphor. The wrestling metaphor is actually pointing to it brings together, right, the two ways in which reality grabs us: the confirming from within, and the surprising from without.
So that's why we're spoken to in parables, isn't it?
I think so.
It takes us thousands of years to make them conscious, and then we keep doing so, and we keep doing so to make them more and more conscious. I mean, it took, taking apart Genesis like that was really revelatory to me but I differed from the atheist because I approached the text with reverence and ignorance and humility, believing that I was nothing in comparison to what it contained.
You thought that there were truths available through transformation, not just through information.
Well, what are we, stupid? Are we stupid? Is that why we were guided by this book for so many thousands of years and preserved it? Is because we're stupid?
Yeah,
I don't think so.
Yeah,
so maybe that means there's something I don't know about it. It's we're all stupid. Either I'm stupid, which is highly probable, or we're all stupid, which is not so highly probable.
I think, as I've said, I think one of my deepest criticisms of the new atheists is precisely the fact. I think I have a lot of criticisms of theism too, because of the way it has bound itself. I mean, current theism, it has bound itself to a Cartesian conception of modernity and reality, and that's why. Go into that. Well,
I want to talk to you about dogma and spirit a bit.
Okay,
but let's leave that. Go into what you just said.
Okay, so I'm going to say thing. I'm going to put a pin in it because we're still trying to do the 4 Ps of knowing. But
it's so hilarious. He still wants to get back to his 4 Ps.
Yeah,
I want to hear what Jordan has to say about dogma, but we'll get to that in a minute. At the beginning here, John is talking about it shines with its suchness and withdraws into its moreness.
Right.
And then he talks about the two ways that reality grabs us.
Right.
And Jordan says these are the two ways that where it has the most meaning to us. When it confirms something that we already know, and when it surprises us with something that we don't know. And it occurred to me while he was talking that that's the very thing that should alert us when we're trapped in an ideology.
Yes,
because
we're not surprised anymore.
When we're
not surprised anymore, we're stuck in the suchness.
Yeah.
And so, unbeknownst to most people, probably, what happened there was John made a bunch of connections that he did not have before, that he's never made before. That actually, I was kind of like, oh, really, John? Okay, didn't know you didn't see that. So he's got a number of his little things that are in opponent processing, like suchness and moreness, which he takes from the Eastern philosophical tradition, roughly speaking, right? So suchness is things as they are, right? The best way to think about that is that they're discrete and linear and certain, right? Whereas moreness is all the uncertainty. Maybe the best way to think about that is it's sort of a continuous unfolding, right? It's nonlinear, it's potential, right? And so potential surprises you and certainty gives you comfort. Right. And so there's that comfort and surprise element. And those are in opponent processing. And he linked that to suchness and moreness. You can hear it in his voice. He's very excited about it. And he actually says in a couple of points, although Jordan kind of talks over him, oh, I hadn't seen that before, right? Like, oh, I didn't make this connection between suchness and moreness and this idea of certainty, or not certainty, intelligibility as having two aspects. That, oh, we feel comfortable when we have the suchness, but we also feel like, oh, okay, we found a new truth in the moreness. Both of those experiences, even though they're opposites in some sense, give us the same feeling about learning something in the world, knowing something, right? Having some knowledge. And yeah, a good way to figure out an ideology is if you're not getting surprised by the things in your worldview, we'll say, or by the specific rules that you're casting in the universe, then you're not in touch with the potential. And so you're stuck in a closed world system, and it's going to collapse into nihilism eventually.
So do suchness and moreness map onto order and chaos?
I think so.
Certainty and potential.
Yeah, certainty and potential. Yeah.
So that's where a lot of anxiety comes from, is people who are stuck in the suchness and fearful of the moreness.
That sounds right to me. Yeah, I mean, that's not the only way people are anxious, but yeah. I mean, when we have a negativity bias in general, right, which evolution says you should, right? You should be fearful of things that kill you, and you don't have to worry about the rest. Right, that's that three. There's three things, right? Not two. It's not away from pain and towards happiness. It's away from pain, and that's good enough. And if you go towards happiness, there's a small risk, actually. So good enough is a better state for evolution. It just isn't generative enough. So you need some bias towards the happiness, or towards the positive state, or towards the unknown.
Well, Jordan would say towards meaning. You want the bias towards meaning, not towards happiness, right?
Right. I'm trying to point to the way people use it now and say, no, we move away from pain and towards happiness or pleasure. It's like, no, we don't. That's definitely not how we act in the world. Observationally untrue. You're a lunatic if you think that. Like, just look at the world. Most people would rather not make a change in their life than make a change that might give them pleasure. That's, you could get a better job. Yeah, but right? And people do that all the time. They do it you could make twice as much money, but I like this job. I'm comfortable. Yes, you're preferring something is not going to hurt you, something that might be better. Yes, you do that all the time. So
because we want to avoid uncertainty.
Right. We want to avoid, because there's a small chance that something that gives us pleasure is going to cause something that we don't expect. Right? When you go into the unknown, when you go into the chaos, when you go into the potential, you don't know what's going to happen. That's the whole point. So that gives us, some anxiety, and people a lot of times would rather pick a known bad answer to the potential of a good answer. Right.
I think that's why people avoid the ineffable.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's lots of reasons, but yeah, that's a good one. Like, it's more comfortable to believe that you're in control of things instead of to understand that you're not, because if you encounter the ineffable, you understand that you're not, right? If you read Nassim Taleb, you kind of understand a lot of these quote patterns we see are randomness. They're purely random. You have no idea what's going on, and you think and then it's like, oop, I don't know, right? And his first book, Fooled by Randomness, is he uses the stock market because he was a trader originally. But the nice thing about it is you can go get the data yourself. You can look at the data, like it's all real world data, and it's easy to understand the stock market, relatively speaking, relative to more abstract concepts, because it's tied to something that you can, really grasp and read a lot about and research. So you can really get the sense for, oh, well, trading is just a big gambling game, basically. Yep. And you can slide the odds in your favor for sure, but there's a limit to how far you can slide those odds in your favor.
Well, okay, so they're going to go on now, and they're going to talk about dogma and criterion. And I think this is a very interesting part here. So I want to play their conversation at this point.
Oh, I just, before you get to that, I'm surprised you didn't bring up the part about the book, right? So the fact that the Bible was written over, however many years and translated by however many people, right, is John's distributed cognition in action. And Jordan's kind of like, who am I compared to this book that survived all this time?
Yes. Oh, yes. I'm surprised too that I didn't bring that up. The
Right.
look on Jordan's face, the anguish, actually, that wasn't anguish. That was a moment of worship there for a moment there, because
Reverence.
reverence. When he was struck by how small he is and compared to what he was trying to analyze in his teaching, you could tell he was overcome by a moment of worship there.
Right. And just like, that's the thing that people miss. And he kind of pointed that out. This is why I take it serious. Unlike the atheists, I don't think I know everything. I think that the people that worked on that book, probably their collective intelligence over the span of time is way bigger than my current intelligence. Yeah, you think? Almost certainly true. And so it's also interesting to note that the people who are generally atheists tend to rely on single individuals like Plato or Heidegger or Nietzsche or whoever the flavor du jour is to prove the point they want to prove, rather than a conglomeration of works written by many people over the years, which in John's framework alone would be distributed cognition, his collective intelligence. That should be smarter than any people alive today. So it's an interesting difference in kind between the references of, we'll say, those who are religious and those who are anti-religious. Because they want to believe that a single person was smart enough to have figured out a thing.
Yep. And I don't know how to put this, so this is going to come out really vapid, I'm sure, but there's also the way that the individual who reads the Bible today, if you read it with reverence and humility, you integrate with it in a different way, where it colonizes you in a different way than it will for an atheist who's reading it, trying to disprove it or trying to find holes in it. They're going to see a completely different book.
Well, so this is John's comment. He says, you thought there were truths available through transformation, not just information. Right. And that's something like reading. So John talks about this in his meditation series. You can read for information or you can read for transformation. Right. They're two different modes of thought almost, although I don't know if he goes that far with it. And then so there's a practice we do that Lectio Divina practice, where you're supposed to have read for information, supposed to have extracted all the information out of the text before you use it as a way to read for transformation. And the reason why is because you've already extracted all the information out of it. And so the only interaction left available to you is a transformative relationship with the text. And so that's built into that Lectio Divina practice that we do on Sundays on the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server. So that's part of what he's talking about there, is that you're supposed to have read these texts so that you can transform from them. And you're right, it's a different way of interfacing with the text per se, is having the humility to be changed by the implications of what you're reading, rather than just take it into yourself or have it, right? So this gets back to having mode and becoming mode. Having mode is very scientific, atheistic, right? Just take it in and I've got the knowledge. I've got the knowledge. It's like, yeah, but you need to be transformed by knowledge, or you don't have the knowledge. The knowledge has you. That's technically ideology right there.
Yeah, that's really good, Mark. Thank you. So let's pick it up here with criteria and dogma.
Look for scientific knowledge in the Bible, not paying attention to how it cultivates wisdom. And the fact
and not knowing that there's any difference between scientific knowledge and wisdom. And this is what I talked about with Stephen Fry recently, because Stephen, who's allied with the atheists, knows that there's such a thing as wisdom, which is why he pursues and embodies myth. But he's annoyed at the church because of its dogma, and he confuses the church with its dogma.
Exactly.
But, you know, I'm also going to say a few positive things about dogma. Dogma is the map.
I think dogma is, you know, in signal detection theory, I think dogma is the inescapable need to set the criterion. At some point, you can't, like,
yes,
in signal detection theory, you have to set the criterion, and all you do to set the criterion, this sounds like Pascal, is you assess the relevance of the risks. Because if you, well, I'll gather more information, but then you have to set the criterion for that.
Yes,
right?
yes,
right?
exactly.
Again and again, and at some point,
yes, that's right. That's right.
But you
okay, so the criterion we're talking about is the worship of that ultimate spirit.
Well,
that's the setting of the criteria. And there's a dogma, there's an element in which dogma serves that. So we can't just because Fry says, well, I like the spirit, but not the dogma. It's like, no, because you have to make a decision. That's your point.
Okay, that's right.
And in every act, there's a decision. So in every act, there's a...
I got to stop it here because there's already too much for me to absorb.
Yeah, there's a lot there for sure.
Yeah.
Right.
So Georgia starts by saying that, you know, you have to take into account the difference between knowledge and wisdom.
Right.
And dogma is the map.
Mm-hmm.
And then John starts to talk about signal detection theory. He makes this leap from dogma is the map to signal detection theory. So I want you to help me unthread this. And then he says, you know, from signal detection theory, we know the inescapable need to set the criterion.
Right.
So what is the connection between the inescapable need to set the criterion and signal detection theory?
So I guess I will state that this is a bad way to think about dogma. There's an easier way to talk about it, I think. And then, so actually, you know, there's a three-part series on religion that is not a religion on the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord YouTube channel that I did with Manuel and Jules. And I think I did a decent part in part 3 when I got to do my slides. But the first part, Jules did some slides and he talked about Dogma and Credo. And John seems to have somewhat, I might be wrong about this, but I don't think so. I remember talking about this with Manuel. John seems to have changed his tune on Dogma and Credo. I think the easiest way to think about Dogma is it's the starting point. It's the way in. And that's the case we make in that first of the written art videos, the part 1, is that we think it's the way in. You need Dogma because you need a way in. And then once you get in, once you have
how
that
are you
stuff
defining dogma though? You're just defining dogma as a set of traditions, the rule book?
It can be. So I like the way Paul van der Klee talks about it, right? So Pastor Paul has this great thing where he says, dogma is not the problem. Dogmatism is the problem, right? Being dogmatic about something is the problem, right? So what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to use the dogma or the creed or the credo, the statements, the propositions, those are all propositions, that's the problem, to get into the tradition that then teaches you how to move past the entrance that you got in from, right? To move past the dogma. That's that to me is the easiest way to understand it. And then so dogma's criteria, you need to, right? They're filters to some extent. You can have a filter. Like if you don't believe in God, I don't know what odds you have of being a Christian or being able to understand the Bible or anything, right? Like I'm not saying you can't understand the Bible in a different way, but you can't understand the Bible the way a Christian understands it if you can't have a belief.
The Bible says it can't be understood by the natural mind. And so, I mean,
right.
And that's what that is. But the way you just laid that out, I hadn't heard Paul do that particular teaching, but it makes so much sense to me because I thought for years, you know, when I was a new believer, I was very, very rule oriented. You know, I wanted to know, what are the rules? What am I supposed to do? You know, because I knew this was what I wanted, but I wanted to be sure I fit into the system and I did all the right things. You know, very, very rule oriented, listening to the right kinds of music, doing all the right things. And then over time, I began to learn more and more about grace. And that began to open up to me more and more exactly what the Bible is talking about, because the Bible is not a set of rules. It's describing the kind of relationship that you can have with the creator of the universe, because he is gracious and merciful and compassionate and loving and just and all of these things. And it's all very complicated, but because you can have this relationship with him, it becomes more of an embodied thing, personally embodied, and then embodied in the wider body of the church and all of that. So it's like you need the propositions in the beginning to just kind of get established, right? Get started.
Yeah.
And
Bootstrap.
then you move past that. But that doesn't, like Jesus said, I do not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. So the law is still an essential part, but it is meant to be completed, not wiped out, but completed. But the completing part goes beyond.
Right. Well, and I would say the difference between, we'll say, dogma and worship is the same as the difference between information and transformation. Right? It's the same as the suchness and the moreness. Dogma is suchness. It's stating a propositional way of interacting with religion. And then the moreness is the transformation, right? Or the transcendence of the dogma, so that you embody it rather than following it. In other words, the dogma shouldn't, in the beginning, the dogma has to constrain you because you need to start somewhere. That's the bootstrapping process. But once you've established yourself and gone through that filter of the dogma, you should be able to transcend it, right? That's the transformation. That's the dealing with the moreness of the religion per se, is when you transcend that dogma.
Well, so that's where the emanation comes from, because you don't transcend the dogma. The moreness draws you up into itself, so that
hopefully.
Yeah.
Well, it might not. I mean, you have to be open to it, right? And yeah. Exactly. You have to have some place to go to, right, into the potential, and then the potential is not positive or negative. So, my argument would be, well, yeah, we all have to aim roughly at the same thing. Otherwise, we can't build bigger things. And so the more people that are aimed at the same thing, the more likely you are to be able to build lasting structures. It's not a guarantee. If you aim at the wrong thing, it still ain't going to work, right? That's the emanation aspect. But that's why if we have a cohesive story that seems to work over time, like we'll just pick one at random, Christianity, then it works. If a lot of people point to it.
Were you a comedian in a former life, Mark?
I used that line earlier today, funnily enough.
I don't know. You always make me laugh. I can't seem to do a conversation with you without laughing.
Oh, that's good. If I'm bringing joy to the world, I'm doing something right. So maybe the Christians won't burn me after all, although maybe they should.
Well, so they're talking about dogma and credo, and so you think it's irrelevant what John means when he says that that in signal detection theory, there's an inescapable need to set the criterion, because I could not understand what he meant when he said that, but you say it's irrelevant.
It's an overly complicated way of explaining what I explained, I think, which is a weird position for me to be in, because remember, my 4 Ps model is based on signal theory. It's actually based on exactly what he's talking about.
Well, what is signal theory?
So the signal theory is just, signals are the things that we make into information. And so in order to detect a signal, you have to set it in a frame, we'll call it a perspective, right? Because otherwise it's not detectable. But once you have a frame and a signal that's detectable within the frame, it turns into information. And then information is the basis of knowledge. And that's actually how the 4 Ps model from our 4 Ps model is arranged. It's arranged on signal detection theory effectively. There's other reasons why we use signals and not like packets of information or other foolish things, like the continuous versus discrete sampling makes a big difference. That also lines up with the math, like because I happen to know signal theory in terms of the math for whatever reason. I don't even remember what I was studying. So I know there's 2 different types of math there, even though I'm a complete math moron. So I understand these things. So that's why we were using that model. I was like, we want to use a signal model because it's going to afford us all of these things later on. And it's turned out to be That's turned out to be a good prediction on my part so far. So it's just funny that John's using it there and not everywhere, because it actually works well with the information and knowledge model, right? Because we're getting stuff all the time, right? We're constantly bombarded by signals, and then we need to curate those signals. To borrow from Matthew on our server, curate your signal.
But what does it mean to set the criterion? Because Jordan goes on to say, then in every act you set the criterion.
Right, because
you're establishing your boundaries.
He's dragging everything back into the religious frame by doing that, right?
But what is that? I mean, simplify it for me. In every act you set the criterion. Does that mean in every act you're developing a set of rules? Or
no, I think actually Jordan's phrasing it backwards on purpose, but it's backwards. In order to, and he does say this, in order to act, you have to have criterion, right? You can't make a decision without a bunch of criterion. That's definitional.
So
decisions require criterion.
Your acts presuppose a criterion.
Yes.
Which exactly. Is why you need the proposition in order to get started.
Exactly.
Okay, so he's saying it backwards. It's no wonder I didn't understand what he meant.
Right, he's saying it backwards on purpose, but he does say it forwards. He says every decision, right? Every decision requires criterion, right? Or every action or something. But it doesn't matter. It's largely irrelevant.
You set the criterion. You accept the relevance of the risks.
Right. Well, that's because. Right. I think John used that first. Not Jordan, but
it might have been John that said that. And then Jordan says the criterion is the worship of the ultimate spirit.
Right, because he's dragging John's thought backwards back into the religious frame there. That's basically what he's doing. He's very good at that, by the way. He's
you
quite
mean
clever.
Accepting the relevance of the risks is somehow associated with worshiping the ultimate spirit?
How are you picking your... Jordan's about to go into this again, too. How are you picking the criterion? Where's the criterion coming from? It's got to come from somewhere. And Jordan's saying, well, it should come from the Bible, basically, is what he's saying. So that's why he's harping on criterion with John, because he's like, where's the criterion coming from, John? Where's that coming from? It's not coming from science. Can't come from science. It's bigger than science. Piaget makes this point. Actually, I was watching an old Piaget video. It's about 4 years old, where he's talking about this. He's talking about how science is embedded in religion. I mean, that's the basic thesis of the video. It's how science is nested in religion. It's about 4 years old from Piaget. And
can you send me the link for that?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a great little video. I haven't finished watching the whole thing, but I've seen about half of it. I already know where Piaget's going. Piaget's easy. I've watched enough of him. I know where he's going. And this is just an older one that I hadn't caught because it was before I sort of caught on to him and started putting time into that. But basically, that's when you're talking about decisions and criterion, like what's a good science versus a bad science, right? Do you really want to cross Ebola and anthrax, right? Do you really want to make a nuclear weapon, right? These are ethical concerns, and ethical concerns are squarely within the realm of religion and squarely outside of the capabilities of science. It's just, that is what it is.
Well, so John goes on from here and he starts talking about Credo in service to Religio. And then he says, when Credo moves from giving your heart to I assert, we stop conceiving of it as in service to Religio. Right.
So John and Religio have an interesting history, right? So he's doing this reinventio with old language, right? And because he's trying to get around religion per se, right? So his short form definition for Religio is connectedness. And at first I hated that. I was like, what is he on? I don't like that. And then I'm like, oh, I see it. So I'm a little slow. So I finally figured out like why that was important, like why that was a good short form definition. And it is. So
I think that's just the meaning of the word in Greek, isn't it? Tied together.
Well, I think it's to bind or something.
Yeah, tied together, something like
that.
Yeah.
Right. It's binding or tying. Right. Yeah. It's not just connectedness per se, but connectedness is a better way to think about it. And this would spin me back into the intimacy crisis, obviously, because that's what I think is causing the meaning crisis. And then interestingly, what John's talking about here, I think without sort of realizing it himself, is that when he talks about engaging in religio as a way of getting connections, comfortable suchness connections, having mode connections, then we go astray. But when we engage in religio as such, as the process of making connections, right? So we're stepping outside of it, very postmodern way of thinking about it, by the way. We're stepping outside of the connectedness and actually, looking for more connectedness. That's very becoming mode or being mode, if we're using Fromm's framework. So I'm not sure if John's made that connection yet either now, based on the other connection. He missed the suchness and the moreness, but all of that seems to be related. Suchness and moreness, having and being, or having and becoming, and this idea of having, being ensconced in the thing versus being able to understand that you're ensconced in the thing to expand it, right? Which is something like recognizing the potential outside of the suchness.
Well, at this point, I feel a little bit like Jordan when he says to John, I'm going to have to think about that.
Sorry, there's a lot of concepts wrapped up there. So I just wrapped up, 4 things that I think are identical, actually, right? It's just 4 identical concepts with a slightly different twist, because we're circumambulating this idea of ways of engaging in things. You can either try to have things and keep them, and that's their suchness, or you can engage with the potential, and that's the moreness, and there's this tension. And that's where we need to sit. And to the earlier point, an ideology only engages you in the suchness and gives you comfort. It never gives you that experience of surprise or maybe awe, which is what you need to engage with potential.
Well, I mean, I'm simple-minded, so I'm still back at what John actually said, which is when Credo moves from giving your heart to I assert,
Right.
which is very simple Christian language for the divide between the mind and the heart is only, what do they say, like 12 inches or something. You can totally miss it by 12 inches if you only focus on Christ with your mind.
Right. And if you think of mind as ego, then
and if you're not transforming that into the heart, then you've completely missed the whole thing.
Exactly.
So the giving your heart has to be connected to the I assert, or the I assert is your way in, and then the giving your heart is the continuance.
Right. Exactly. It's the transcendence and the transformation, right? Because the only way to transcend is to transform. So you have to have a way in, but then you have to have a way to transform your way in, right?
So where we ended up, John had just said that he has a problem with theism because it has bound itself to a Cartesian conception of modernity and reality, which we've talked about quite a lot already.
Right. Skip that. Yeah.
So it's a kind of knowing that creates affordances that make all other knowing possible.
Well, that's participatory. So he tries to launch into the 4 Ps here, right? So he's talking
pretty far, actually, but why don't you just summarize that part?
Sure. So participatory knowing is the field of affordances. And then perspectival knowing makes certain affordances salient, right? So that's your situational awareness, roughly speaking, right? And then that's also, this idea around like how you're transforming, right? So when you're participating, you have that agent arena relationship, that process of co-identification, right? But he keeps going through the stack basically and says, the salient landscape's important, and that's stuck in perspectival. But what happens is when he goes back into participatory knowing, Jordan interrupts him and says, look, there's a lot there, because you have to kind of know what your values are in order to do this participation. And
okay, that's the part at 152. So we'll pick it up there and listen to what Jordan has to say at that point. That got us through about 4 minutes that we didn't have to listen to, which is good. So we're going to pick it up at 152.
the cup metaphor you used. There's a lot lurking behind the scenes there, and you hit your listener with that when you lay out that. So I'm going to ask you to do that again, if you would, and I'm going to listen to it again.
I'm happy to do so, and I know that my
presuming
passion,
that if I don't understand it, there are probably a few other people who don't.
I think that's a fair,
who are listening.
That's a fair assumption, and I do not want my entheos to undermine my attempts at logos. So we'll put it that way. So the participatory knowing. You know, we participate in affordances. It generates a field of affordances for us.
Okay, so that, let me stop you there. Okay, so my value structure determines what field of affordances manifests itself to me.
So tell me more about what you mean by value structure, because if you mean,
well, value is the determinant of my attentional resources. I'm going to attend to that which I believe is most valuable. And so I have a value hierarchy lurking in the background. That's in that deep unconscious, let's say. But that value hierarchy should be predicated on the manifestation of the highest spirit. So what I should want to afford itself to me are those affordances that afford me the opportunity to pursue the path of the highest spirit. If I'm oriented properly, if I'm worshiping properly, yes or no? Sorry, it's not a command.
Constitutively or all?
I think he realized how he sounded right then. It's that French, yes or no.
Well, you need, again, he needs an answer to this, right? Because this is pivotal to his conception around what's going on in the world today. Like the whole thing pivots on this question of where are these values coming from and what does that mean? Because if we have values, then the power narrative is wrong, period. End of statement, the power narrative is all done.
Well, is this a place where Jordan and John are not on the same page? Because John seems a little bit surprised when Jordan brings this up about my value structure determines what field of affordances manifests itself to me.
Right. Well,
value is the determinant of my attentional resources. I mean, he's been hammering that for years.
It's a problem. It's a big problem.
That's like half of his biblical lectures. He talked about that very thing, that it's where you fix your gaze that orients everything that comes into your salience landscape. So
So here's the problem, Karen. Here's the problem as I see it. And I have to be a little careful. So I'll try to be as careful as I can and as fair to John's position as I can, because now we're in the 4Ps model, and we already know Mark does not agree with John on his model. We have a slightly different model. So John has at times put perspectival first, and perspectival, to his earlier point, which he made just before this, is your salience landscaping. So sometimes he lists perspectival first, and sometimes he lists participatory first. This time he went with participatory. There's a fundamental contradiction there, and he's not, I don't think he can get around it. Like I don't see a way around that contradiction.
When you say first, does that mean foundational?
Yes.
Okay.
Foundational. So.
Yeah, he said that several times. He said the participatory knowing is that which affords all other kinds of
types of knowing.
Yeah.
Right. That's new to the best of my knowledge. He said that about perspectival before, but I don't recall him saying that about participatory. But the problem is he doesn't take seriously, and maybe Jonathan Peugeot hasn't said it to John, the idea that our world is attention, which is very much, Peterson is very much up that alley, right? Like Peugeot says it all the time. Your world is attention. Yes, that's what your world is, because you're too small and you can't pay attention to anything like enough to do anything with. Like, even if you could pay attention to 100 times more than you can, it doesn't solve anything. You just get more confused because you still need a value structure, right? And this is why it's important that we all point roughly in the same direction, because if we're not all pointing in the same direction, roughly in the same direction, we can't orient with each other. And we end up with little tiny religions, and they do weird things like we're seeing around us today, by the way. So and this strikes at the problem with John's model, in my opinion, is that it doesn't account for the value structure. There's nowhere in his 4 Ps that you're going to derive values. And therefore, there's no way to aim attention. And you can throw attention in relevance realization, which, by the way, we have done. We are guilty of this sin, if you will. We've thrown attention into relevance realization. We may change that. But right now, the last I checked, I think Manuel and I are still on the same page on this, that relevance realization contains your attention. But what informs your intention? Well, that's a whole different question. And John's 4 Ps model, as near as I can tell, doesn't, at least as published to date, doesn't have a way to fix that. There's nothing that talks about how you can adjust your salience landscape. And in this version of the 4 Ps, he's saying that all of our options and all of our affordances are in the participation and are generated somehow by the participatory. So the whole field of reality, as we experience it, is sitting in participatory knowing. It's interesting because it fits Piaget, embodied knowledge and everything comes up, which Peterson talks about quite a bit, right? And they're both Piaget fans. But it doesn't solve the problem Jordan's pointing to, which is value matters and these structures matter. And where are you putting the hierarchy?
Well, I find what you're saying extremely surprising because I have not watched I've watched very little of John's series actually, but I've heard bits of it through Paul as he talks about it. And I know that one of the big parts of John's teaching is the whole idea of combinatorial explosion.
Right.
So he certainly understands the problem.
Yes.
Of the scattered attention. But so you're saying he teaches about the combinatorial explosion, but he doesn't teach about a method for reining that in?
No, he does. He calls it rationalization, but the way he views combinatorial explosion is not the way you characterized it, I think. So the way he views combinatorial explosion is, I'm standing here and there's too many options. So he views it as options, right? And or affordances, which means they're sitting in the participatory and you're not solving, he hasn't solved that problem. He says, so we need a way to do that, and rationalization and relevance realization. Those are his 2 magical bullets, and he fires those bullets pretty regularly. And I've been, from the beginning, I've been like, oh, when you say rationalization, what do you mean? Like, what is the magic in rationalization that reduces combinatorial explosion? And I just mean that as a genuine, like, I don't know. And in our model, we have rationalization in our model for a reason, right? And it describes something that we use the word for, which is why we use it, because we're pragmatists and we're like, everybody uses the word this way. So that must be one of the ways we use the word anyway. So we'll just fit it in the model because it fits right here. And reason, we're a little bit fuzzier about. We're still playing with where to put that in our models. So we're not sure it goes in the intelligibility engine, the 4 Ps that we discussed before, but it's certainly involved, right? But then those 2 don't solve the problem either, even if you posit those 2 and relevance realization. You still don't solve the problem. You just have 3 points of points of contention that you can use to orient, and that's what's important. But even orientation doesn't solve the problem of what to orient to, which is what Jordan's pointing to. What do you orient to? Because even if you have all the functionality, all the processes, all the procedures for orientation, you still have to know what to orient to. That's what Jordan's on about.
Well, I mean, the way Jordan has explained it before sounds almost mystical, because Jordan talks about how you're at each moment in time, you're faced with a field of infinite possibilities. And there's too many choices. There's no way to make the choices of how to cross that field. So you have to have a goal, and a goal will orient you. But
Right.
if you fix your eyes on the highest goal of which you can conceive, then what will come into your salience landscape are those things that will help you to achieve the goal that this highest good is putting before you.
Yep.
So it's almost as though, I don't want to use the word magic, but it shows up in your salience landscape. It's like the patterns become more apparent to you of what you need in order to traverse the landscape.
That's true. That's concurrent with John. Absolutely. That would absolutely happen in John's model. That's
Okay.
absolutely true. But it doesn't solve the problem of how do you know the good and that you're aimed at it, and what does it look like, right? Like what not what does it look like in detail, but like what is the good, right? It's that question's still wide open. And I think Jordan knows that question's wide open. And I think he's trying to use John to solve it here. And John's not going to help him on that, because John doesn't have a solution to that either, near as I can tell, at least not that I've heard him say.
Well, except that I think that Jordan,
He makes an appeal to the little voice. John does too, by the way. They both make the same appeal.
well, you remember I told you that in that video where he's talking about tragedy versus evil, he sort of makes the statement that reality and the ultimate good inhabit the same space. Right?
Yes.
So in a sense, when Jordan draws that map of, okay, you conceive of the highest good and that's what you're headed towards, and you move off in that direction, but maybe your aim isn't as good as it should be, and maybe you misconceived where that highest good was. So actually, maybe it's over here. So you might fall back a little bit here, but then you have to go up again, and maybe it's moved off, and maybe it's a little farther away than you thought it was, but you're always moving on some trajectory that's up towards that highest good. And that trajectory is going to inform your path.
Right.
So it's almost as though when he's talking about that the ups and downs of that trajectory are those moments when you come up against your own error, when you're trying to perceive reality, you're trying to draw close to this reality that is also the ultimate good. You discover the places where you err, where you sort of are meeting the transcendent.
Yes. Yeah.
And that, so it's sort of what works. It's almost this pragmatism thing that wants his viewpoint.
Yeah, I agree. That sounds right to me.
Okay.
Yeah. And like I said, that fits with John. I mean, John's going to make the same appeals. He basically appeals, the voice, the voice, the inner sage, the inner sage. It's like, really? I don't know that everybody does. I mean, maybe, but I don't know that. I know maybe I'd like to think I do, but that's a scary proposition, right? Because now you're relying on yourself rather than relying on something else. It's funny that they keep doing that.
It's simple for a Christian, because for a Christian, it's just Hebrews 11:6. Maybe fix your eyes on Jesus, the author, perfecter of your faith, who for the joy set before him. So the joy was set before him, and in the same way that the highest good is set before us, fix your eyes on Jesus. In his case, the joy that was set before him enabled him to endure the cross and scorn its shame and sit down at the right hand of the Father. So it's this upward gaze, but we're told where to fix our gaze.
Right.
And Jordan is trying to figure out where that upward gaze is.
Exactly. And both John and Jordan make an appeal to this inner voice thing. They both do it. And they just got done talking about Credo and Religio, and how if Religio is in service to Religio and not in service to something outside of Religio. And I'm like, doesn't the same apply to the small voice and the values? But they never make that connection. I don't know why they don't see this. I see it quite clear. I'm like, you still have the internal problem.
Clarify what you just said.
So when they were talking about Credo and Religio, and how, if Religio connectedness is in service just to connectedness, it doesn't work because you haven't opened your heart. You've just, you've understood it mentally, we'll say, right? So they know this concept of having only the inner view as corrupting. It's inherently corrupting. And yet they both make appeals to the inner voice. And I'm like, that sounds like the same thing to me. If you're making an appeal to your inner voice, where's the external appeal so you don't get corrupted? And that's that whole concept of angel on one shoulder, devil on the other thing. Right. I have way more than one inner voice. I mean, I took Jordan's personality class. And in John's meditation series, there's a bunch of monkeys in your head and they're all pulling you in different directions. Okay. But then there's an inner sage. How do I know it's not one of the monkeys? There's a question.
Yeah.
I mean, so they're not, they're not solving the problem that they know exists. Like, see the problem here and here and here and here and here. It's the same problem, guys. It's got to be here too. Like, what? I don't know. But this is where Jordan's trying to use John's stuff to get outside, I think. And it's not going to work because John doesn't have an outside as near as I can tell. He certainly doesn't. If he does, he doesn't invoke it here. But this is a very complicated back and forth, because for Jordan, because John starts from participatory, this is all his interruptions are here, pretty much all of them. And he just keeps interrupting John, trying to get him. No, which is it? Are you directed by your ideal? Are the affordances affording you by design, right? Or I'm sorry, the design, right? Add the design, which is that Heidegger concept, right? So where's the design? Is the world calling me forth, right? Does the world have a structure, culture, nature, etc.? Like, and then something's generating affordances, but like you didn't make your body, so you're constrained within it, and that's part of your participation. You can shape and move your body, but that's about it. But that's your knowing at the level of embodiment. That's the participatory knowing, is how you're moving through the world, at least in this particular version of John's conception.
Yeah. So he talks about that at 157. Let's pick it up there.
Okay.
And how did my screen? Oh, there it is. Okay.
Yes, well, that's the dogma element as well.
Perhaps.
That's the element of structure.
I know it's silly.
Oops.
6'5", 300 pounds. I ride motorcycles on the weekends, so the thought.
Sure, it's the element of setting the criterion. It's the element of what already is. And it's respect for that.
But it's also the element of, that the world is also shaped independently of me, sometimes by culture, sometimes by technology, but sometimes by nature itself, such that I can make a purchase on the world. I want to resist the romantic notion that the world is a blank slate that I simply express myself upon. The world has its own structure that constrains and puts demands on me. So and sometimes we work with that. Like if this,
yes, as revealed in our errors.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. And if this cup didn't have what Spinoza would call its Kenosis, its structure, its resistance to force, I couldn't use it to hold water, etc. That's what I meant. So let's say that a participatory knowing generates the affordances, and we've got some variation on that we're playing around with. But then what I would say is the perspectival knowing makes them salient to me. So this is graspable right now to me, and I foreground it. I size it up. I salience landscape around it. It's present to me now in the way that other affordances are not present to me.
Okay, why is that different than what we just discussed?
I don't think it's different, but what I wanted to make room for was a distinction between them, because I wanted there to. I mean, I think you would agree with it. I wanted there to be an unconscious level at which we know the world, at which the world and I are being co-shaped together. We talked about that before, and so that's what I'm trying to make a place for with the participatory knowing. I want to make that it precedes us in an important way, as sort of self-aware beings. Perspectival.
The room is there before you walk into it.
The room is there, but also my body. I mean, this is the big thing about embodiment. It's taking the body deeply seriously as constituent of my cognition. If I didn't make my body, right? I participate in it. I can shape it. I can move it. But
it's given to you in a sense as well. It's
given to me, exactly. And that givenness constrains the way in which the world can be given to me. That's what I'm trying to say. And I want to make a deep, I'm for
that's the definition of reality.
Well, yeah, at least the one sense we were talking about earlier. But
Yeah.
See, I
Right.
take embodiment deeply seriously. And so another way of
Yes.
putting it is participatory knowing is knowing at the level of our embodiment.
I think that's why the Christians emphasize the resurrection of the body, by the way.
I mean, what Jonathan said about the Christians emphasizing the body and the goodness of the world over against the Gnostics, I'm a little bit worried about that term, because Gnosticism wasn't a group of people. It's more like a style of religiosity, like fundamentalism. But I get his point. There were certain, at least the Valentinians.
Yes, well, I mean, it really struck me, that valorization of the body, this insistence across, and this is something, again, I would say that the new atheists don't appreciate at all. It's like, well, the resurrection of the body. Well, what does that mean? It means profound respect for the body. It means attributing to the body the value of the spirit, but it means something psychologically, which is what you're getting at
Exactly.
here, which
exactly.
is consciousness is not separate in some sense from
No, that's exactly
the body.
it. Yeah. So the participatory knowing is at the level of embodiment. And then your consciousness, your state of mind, makes certain affordances salient to you. That's what situational awareness is. That's what the whole psychology of situational awareness is. Like, how do people pick up on the affordances that are available? How do they make them present? How do they also present themselves to it? Right.
So we probably went a little bit too far there.
That's okay. Yeah, well, he bled the perspectival into the, right? He kept trying to move on, right? And and I think, I mean, he capitulated to Peterson when he said, no, you're talking about the same thing when you talk about participatory and perspectival, because they have the same element of value creation, right? And John's trying to get out of that because he can't speak to that. As near as I can tell, he cannot talk about how we're valuing things. Like, salience landscaping is definitely doing some valuing, but he wants to put the unconscious in the participatory.
Well, when he said, I wanted there to be, I'm trying to differentiate these two, because I wanted there to be an unconscious level at which the world and me are shaped for each other.
Yes.
And Jordan goes on to kind of define that as a gift, right? I mean, John says, my body is given me and constrains the way I can interact with the world. And Jordan says, yes, it's given to you,
Right. Well, he's pointing at the idea that it's coming from something outside of yourself.
Yes.
And John's Furi Cog Psi. So Furi Cog Psi starts from the brain and goes out. So they're never going to intersect.
Back down to this very, very practical, ironclad, materialistic level. Jordan is off here in this space, and John keeps bringing it back down in here. So
well, he has to. That's where he plays. I mean, look, you're Cog Psi. That's you're embodied already, and you're looking out.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, is that this is what the whole battle is, right? It's Paul's eyes towards heaven, eyes towards the ground thing, right? Like, yeah, you've got to start somewhere, and then that determines which way you're looking. And if you're not looking in both ways equally, roughly speaking, then you're going to miss a lot of stuff. So,
but I really thought it was surprising the way Jordan brings it back around to the resurrection of the body.
Yep.
Didn't you find, when you first heard that, didn't you think, whoa, that's an interesting flip?
I didn't think it was a flip. I was.
I mean, not flip, but you know what I mean.
No,
Leap.
I was taken aback by this new 4 Ps, because John hasn't talked about participatory that way before that I recall. Like, this isn't how he normally talks about the 4 Ps. At first, he didn't put them in rank order at all, right? And then he started to say, no, it's perspectival first. And I know why he did that. Like, I understand the mappings that he's using and why he's holding on to that, I think. But to hear him go in this direction and then put the unconscious in the participatory, I was like, whoa, that's an interesting move. But I knew right away that was going to be problematic, and Jordan just found it real quick. So I was like, yeah, that's not surprising. Jordan's pretty quick. So yeah, that didn't surprise me so much that he found the problem so quickly. What surprised me was that John made the move. I was like,
help me out. What is the problem with since I don't know these 4 Ps all that well, what's the problem with putting the unconscious in the participatory?
Well, so again,
When
I mean,
he's participatory, he means something beyond tacit knowledge. Is that right?
right. It's right. It's learning through mimicry, we think, right? In our model, participatory is learning through mimicry, right? Or direct interaction, right? As opposed to learning by being told or taught, right? And so one of the things I invoke is that, I think they still do it in Asia, but even in the medieval period, there's a long line of people who worked with their hands, who went to apprentice, and they were never told what to do. They were shown what to do. And in the East in particular, but also in the medieval period, you showed up and you didn't talk, right? And this is a big deal in monasteries, for example. Even today, you show up and you shut up, right? And then if you go to martial arts course, because I took martial arts, what they do is they don't tell you how to stand much beyond knees shoulder width apart. That's it. That's all they tell you. And then they start knocking you over and you keep getting up and they keep knocking you over until you stop falling over. That's basically how they do it. They don't, it's not propositional and it's not procedural, right? You're learning through participation. You're learning the poetic way to hold your body in participation with your surroundings, in this case, the floor, right? And because you need to learn the relationship of your unique center of gravity, right? Which is determined by how low you are and how strong your muscles are to hold you up, right? Which is determined by the length of your leg. There's a ton of things, there's all this math, like you can't describe it with math. There's just too many pieces, right? The length of your spine, the length of your legs, etc.
Same realm as bicycle riding and skating and all of that kind of thing.
Right. And the confusion is that you can describe things through language, but language, when you're using language, you are propositional and procedural. Like there's no way around the constraint. So when you're trying to describe things that aren't propositional procedural, they sound propositional procedural. And this is confusing the thing for the description of the thing again, right? Like, is it the description? Is it the thing? I don't know, right? And so the participation is very much learning through mimicry. So why John wrapped embodiment in it so heavily, I don't know, because the first caveat I use with participation is you can participate in a conversation. So we don't wrap participation up in embodiment, which is not to say embodiment is, of course, it's part of it. Like I can't converse without a body, but we don't talk about it that much because the embodiment part's not all that interesting to us. What's interesting to us is that you can model a conversation and people can mimic it. That's participatory knowledge, right? And then you don't get true deep participatory knowledge until you do it, right? Because that's what it's about. You have to make the mistakes yourself so that you learn from where you are, where the boundaries are of the whatever you're trying to learn.
Well, so it doesn't necessarily have to be learning through mimicry, though. I mean, maybe that's the way John defines it, but
no, that's the way we define it: through mimicry and doing, right?
well, the doing. Yeah, I was going to say
right. Those are the two ways you learn participatory knowing.
Yeah, well,
right?
The doing would be more. Well, the doing was what came into my mind more. Like you can't learn to paint by reading a book about it.
Right, and you can't necessarily learn enough by watching.
But then you just have to do it.
Right. But the mimicry component would not be reading a book about it. The mimicry component would be me watching people paint. And that is a way to learn to paint. It just won't teach you everything you need to know because you can't know until you do, because you have to be transformed by it, not just informed by it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So the mimicry can give you some information, but it isn't until you do that it gets integrated into you.
Right. And some things are like physical things that you do with your hands are best learned by watching people do it, not by being told how to do it. And that's a huge difference. This is the difference between propositional and non-propositional.
By watching them do it and then participating in it, in the doing with them.
Right.
And then that's the embodiment. That has to be embodiment. So it makes perfect sense that he brought embodiment into it.
Well, he hasn't done it in that way before, right? But then, like I said, it creates a bunch of problems. Well, if you limit it to embodiment, because again, you can participate in a conversation, right? So that's not quite so embodied. Like again, yeah, it requires a body, duh, but it's not embodied. It's very non-embodied. So it's interesting that he's starting with the physicalism, with the objective material reality side, and going out from there, because we never start there. Because A, it's obvious. We don't need to explain that to people. Everybody gets it. Like, they know I learned participation by actually doing things. Like, everybody gets that right away. Thing they don't get is the mimicry piece, which is your way in, right? And just the same way, and John goes into this too, right? Like, you can be given a proposition or told something is true, but unless you wrestle with the idea in your head, you don't really have a grasp of it, right? It's the same thing. There's two modes on each side of the learning equation, basically. And you need to embody both modes. And one is shallow to get you hooked in, like we talked about with the dogma. And the other one is deeper because you're actually participating with it in some sense, or grappling with it in some sense, or struggling with it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think maybe we've gone on long enough. We've gone on like an hour and 45. So maybe we should wrap it up on the resurrection of the body. And the last thing Jordan said was consciousness is not separate from the body. So I don't know if that would warrant a longer discussion about the whole. See, I'm not a philosopher either, so, and I'm not a theologian, so I've never gotten into this whole argument about dualism and monism and
Yeah, that all sounds
Cartesian world and all of that kind of stuff. So.
That all sounds overly complicated to me too. Yeah, I mean, I don't. Where consciousness is located gets back to the concept of a soul. Like, I don't know why that. Yeah, people don't. Like, that should be obvious. Like, there's consciousness, and is that part of your soul or not? And then what's a soul, right? And it's that rabbit hole. And so, yeah, I mean, if you want to try to go down that rabbit hole next time, I can certainly do my best, although I'm at a loss for where anybody's going when they're talking about consciousness. But
yeah, I mean, we've talked about that a lot from the physics standpoint of it. So I'm not sure we need to go into it here, but I think the last part of it is when they're going into the whole issue of postmodernism and la différence and all that stuff, right? And
so John has to finish his 3 Ps, and Jordan doesn't interrupt him for the last 3, really, so he breezes through them. And then they go into Heidegger, postmodernism, icons, right? They grab Peugeot back in. John talks a little about Tai Chi. It's actually not that long. There's some discussion about religion that is not a religion, or something like that, right? Around difference and those sorts of things. But yeah, there's a nice section left.
Yeah, so maybe we can hammer that out one more time. And
I think so. Yeah, I hope so. You know, the other 3 Ps, as John describes them, Jordan doesn't even interrupt. We could just play that if you wanted, and it's pretty straightforward. But I can always add whatever flavor.
Yeah, maybe we'll start with that next time, and
that sounds good.
We'll go on to postmodernism and all the rest of that stuff. As usual, it's always fun talking to you, Mark.
Well, thank you, Karen. It's fun talking to you. I'm learning a lot going through this process. So
well, the reason you're learning is because I'm asking you questions that makes you think about what you're thinking.
Well, that's good. That's
all the information.
Yeah, that's what I need. Well, I don't know about that, but well, even just having to watch the video again, I'm like, oh, I missed that, and I missed this, and how did I miss that? That's not in my notes, so it's good. It's great stuff. Thank you.
Okay, see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.